The son who ordered his comatose father taken off life support was doing so without hesitation. But everything changed completely when the Mafia boss overheard a single sentence from the nurse. On the 58th floor penthouse, deep in the Manhattan night, darkness lay thick and heavy, broken only by the shimmer of city lights below like a million distant stars. Yet inside this room, there was nothing but a deathly silence, and the lingering scent of gunpowder still hanging in the air. Winston Kovac lay sprawled across the cold marble floor, his back braced against the leg of the sofa, one hand clutched tightly over his chest where the wound was spreading through his black suit jacket. Each breath came hard and uneven, and the eyes once sharp as steel were slowly losing their familiar light. Standing before him was Bradley, his half-brother, the gun still smoking in his hand. Bradley's handsome face was twisted now by a frenzy he could no longer control, his green eyes blazing with the hatred that had smoldered for 29 years. He stepped closer, the barrel aimed directly at his brother's head, and his voice dripped with venom as he said that Winston had always had everything: their father's love, everyone's respect, the entire empire, and now he was going to lose it all, and Bradley would be the last person he ever saw. Winston tried to speak, his voice faint but still strangely calm, and told him that he could still stop this. Bradley let out a harsh laugh, the sound echoing through the empty room like something rising out of hell, and shot back that stop this. He had waited for this moment his entire life. At that very same time, at Mount Sinai Hospital, Iris Bellamy had just finished an endless night shift when her phone began to vibrate. An unknown number. She hesitated for a second, then answered. Frank DeLuca's urgent voice came through the line, telling her that Miss Bellamy, the boss has been shot. He is on the way to the hospital. You need to get here right now. The phone slipped from Iris's hand and struck the floor with a dry, hollow sound. In that instant, the world around her seemed to stop turning. The man whose father she had risked everything to save. The man she couldn't bring herself to admit she thought about every single day. The most powerful man in New York was now standing at the edge of death. And the person who had pulled the trigger was no one else but his own brother. What had led to this tragedy? Why had blood family become enemies who couldn't exist beneath the same sky? Why had one of the most powerful dynasties of all fallen apart from within? To understand that fateful night, we have to turn back the clock to 3 months earlier, when everything first began to collapse. When the first pill was swallowed, when the traitor's smile was still radiant as sunlight. If you want to know what happened, stay with us until the very end of the story. And don't forget to like, share this video with the friends you know, love deeply emotional stories, and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the stories still to come. 3 months before that fateful night, Kovac Tower still rose over Midtown Manhattan like an emperor daring the very sky to challenge him. The 60-story building of glass and steel gleamed beneath the sun, a symbol of absolute power that the Kovac family had built over 4 decades through sweat, tears, and things far darker that no one dared speak of. The penthouse, on the 58th floor, was where Victor Kovac often sat each afternoon. The 62-year-old man whose name alone had once made the entire East Coast underworld tremble, now seated beside the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking down at the city he regarded as his own domain. His hair had turned white as snow, his harsh face bore the marks of time and ruthless decisions, yet his eyes were still sharp as blades, still capable of making anyone lower their head with a single glance. He had stepped away from the life 5 years earlier, retreating behind the curtain so his eldest son could take over everything, but his shadow remained large enough to shelter and protect this vast empire. Winston stood beside his father, reporting on the latest real estate deal in Hudson Yards. He was 33, broad-shouldered as though he could carry the whole world, with a hard-edged face marked by a faint scar running from the corner of his left eye down to his cheek, a remnant of the internal purge when he was 26, when a traitor had tried to stab him from behind. Winston's eyes were as cold as steel tempered in fire, and his voice was deep and even, every word carrying the weight of absolute power without ever needing to rise. The doors of the private elevator suddenly opened, and Bradley walked in with a smile as bright as morning sunlight, a finely carved, lacquered red wooden box in his hand. He called out with excitement, "Father, I have a gift for you." Victor turned, and the sternness that usually filled his eyes softened at once when he looked at his youngest son. Bradley was 29, handsome in an entirely different way from Winston, softer, more approachable, with a smile that always seemed to rest on his lips. His green eyes came from the mother who had left when he was still a child, utterly different from his brother's cold, gray stare. Bradley opened the box, and inside were capsules of shimmering emerald green beneath the light. With obvious pride, he explained that they were herbs from the Alps, specially ordered from Switzerland, meant to strengthen the liver and kidneys of an older man. Victor smiled warmly and reached up to stroke Bradley's head, as if he were still the 5-year-old boy who once ran to cling to his leg whenever he was afraid. Then he turned to Winston and said that my youngest son always knows how to care for his father. Winston, do you see? Your brother is such a kind boy. Winston nodded and looked at his brother with absolute trust, saying, You did well, Bradley. Then Victor swallowed the first capsule, washing it down with a sip of whiskey, never knowing that this was the beginning of the tragedy that would tear this family apart. That night, in his own luxurious apartment on the Upper West Side, Bradley stood alone before the large mirror in his bedroom. The apartment was expensive, filled with the finest luxury items, yet it was cold in its emptiness, without the warmth of family, without the sound of loved ones laughing. The bright smile he had worn earlier in front of his father and brother had vanished completely, replaced by a bitterness that hollowed out every line of his handsome face. Bradley stepped toward the painting hanging on the wall and pulled it aside, revealing the carefully concealed safe behind it. He entered the code, opened the safe, and took out a small vial of white powder fine as chalk. Thallium, a colorless and odorless poison, the favored weapon of professional assassins because it was nearly impossible to detect through ordinary testing. Bradley stared at the vial in his hand, then lifted his eyes to his own reflection, and the painful memories came rushing back like a flood that could no longer be held back. He remembered himself at 10 years old, standing outside his father's study door, secretly listening as Victor told a guest that Winston is my greatest pride, that boy was born to lead. Not a single word about the second son. He remembered himself at 15, watching Winston being led by their father into his first important meeting, while he was told that you are still young. Go back to your room. He remembered himself at 20, watching Winston take control of everything in the empire, while he was handed only the petty tasks no one else wanted. His entire life, he had been nothing more than the pale shadow of his perfect older brother. Bradley whispered to himself in the mirror, his voice cold as ice, that they would see, when father dies, Winston will fall apart, and in the chaos I will prove that I am more worthy. He carefully poured some of the thallium into the bottle of emerald capsules, mixing it thoroughly so no one would notice any difference. He muttered that slowly. Little by little, no one will suspect a thing. Father will grow sick, then die naturally, and I will have everything. Bradley's smile in the mirror was chilling beyond words. The smile of a man who had waited far too long and was now willing to do anything to claim what he wanted. 3 weeks had passed since Victor swallowed the first capsule. 3 weeks during which Bradley waited with the patience of a python stalking prey in the dark. That morning, the conference room on the 40th floor of Kovac Holdings was filled with all 12 people, seated around a mahogany table nearly 20 feet long, every one of them among the most powerful figures in the family's business empire. Victor sat at the head of the table as always, Winston at his right, Bradley at his left. The meeting that day was about expanding into the Los Angeles market, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Victor was in the middle of speaking about their strategy for entering the market when he suddenly stopped. He lifted a hand to his forehead, beads of sweat breaking across his skin, even though the conference room was kept at 64 degrees. Winston noticed at once that something was wrong. He called for his father, but Victor did not answer. Winston shot to his feet just as Victor collapsed forward onto the table, sending stacks of documents scattering across the floor. The entire room erupted into chaos. Some people shouted, others rushed forward. Chairs crashed noisily as they toppled over. Winston roared for someone to call an ambulance immediately, his voice thundering through the room with a panic no one had ever heard from this cold and controlled man. He dropped to his knees on the floor and gathered his father's head into his lap, his face of iron now twisted by pure fear. The hands that had never trembled while holding a gun, that had signed death sentences for enemies without hesitation, now shook as they touched his father's skin. He kept calling for him, begging him to open his eyes, but Victor only breathed in weak, shallow pulls, his gaze dull and fixed on the ceiling as if he no longer recognized anyone. Behind them, Bradley stood as still as stone, his face so pale it looked nearly drained of blood. Yet if anyone had looked closely into those green eyes, they would have seen something else there, not the fear of losing a father, but the cold calculation of a man waiting for his plan to succeed. 30 minutes later, Mount Sinai Hospital trembled with urgency as Victor's gurney burst through the glass doors of the emergency department. 6 bodyguards in black suits ran alongside it like a moving wall, their faces as tense as though they were protecting the president himself. Iris Bellamy was standing at the nurse's station reviewing patient charts when she heard the unusual commotion from the entrance. She looked up just as the gurney swept past, and in that instant, her brown eyes met the gray eyes of the man running beside it. Those eyes were cold as ice, sharp as blades, yet filled with such suffocating desperation that her heart seemed to seize inside her chest. Her breath caught for the briefest second. She did not know who that man was. She did not know that the old man on the gurney was the Mafia boss whose name had once made the entire East Coast tremble. She only knew that those eyes, the eyes of a man terrified of losing the most important thing in his life, were something she would never forget. She asked the colleague beside her what was happening, and the woman answered that it was a major VIP case, and rumor had it the entire 12th floor was going to be reserved for them. Iris frowned. She had always hated VIP cases. Money and power always brought trouble. They always came with absurd demands and an attitude of entitlement, but she did not know that this case would completely change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Victor was rushed into the emergency room, and the doctors and nurses raced against time, while the machines shrieked and voices called out non-stop. Outside in the hallway, Winston stood with his back pressed against the cold white wall, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails bit into his palms, blood seeping out without his even noticing. Beside him, Bradley stood motionless like a statue, lifting a hand now and then to wipe at his eyes, tears he had practiced in front of a mirror hundreds of times, until they looked exactly like the tears of a son, afraid of losing his father. Bradley asked his brother in a trembling voice whether he thought their father would be all right. Winston did not answer immediately. He only stared at the emergency room doors as if he could see through them. At last he spoke, his voice sounding as though he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else, saying that father will be fine. He is Victor Kovac. He cannot fall like this. He has survived things far worse than this. Bradley placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his face full of concern and care, and said that I am here with you. You are not alone. Winston nodded and laid his own hand over his brother's in a rare gesture of gratitude. He had no idea that the hand gripping his shoulder in comfort, the hand of the younger brother he had protected all his life, was the very hand that had mixed poison into every capsule, the very hand that had been poisoning their father for the past 3 weeks. 2 days after Victor was admitted to Mount Sinai Hospital, life kept moving with its usual ruthless pace for people like Iris Bellamy. At 4 a.m, she had just finished a 14-hour shift, her legs aching with exhaustion and her eyes burning from lack of sleep, but she did not go home right away. Instead, she took the subway across the city to another hospital in Brooklyn, where Molly was lying. The tiny 240-square-foot studio apartment in Astoria, Queens, the place Iris had called home for the past 3 years, would have to wait a few more hours. Molly Bellamy, 22 years old, the only sister Iris had left in this world, lay in her hospital bed with skin pale as paper and intravenous lines running into her thin arm, yet her eyes still lit up like a small flame in the dark the moment she saw her sister walk into the room. Molly asked in surprise why she had come at such an hour, and Iris sat down beside the bed, took her sister's icy hand in hers, and answered that she had just finished her shift and wanted to stop by to see her for a little while before going home. Molly frowned with concern and said that Iris was working too much, asking if she ever slept at all. Iris smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes, and she told her to worry about her own health and let her take care of everything else. Molly looked at her with a sadness sharp enough to hurt, and softly apologized, saying that because of her, Iris had to work so hard. Iris tightened her grip on her sister's hand, her voice firm but full of love as she told her not to say such things, that she was everything Iris had left in this world, and she would do whatever it took to make her well again. $180,000 in medical bills, that number pressed against Iris's chest each night like a slab of stone when she lay alone in her cramped apartment. She worked 70 hours a week, lived in a space so small it felt suffocating, had not bought a single new piece of clothing in 2 years, and survived on the cheapest meals she could find, all just to chip away at that mountain of debt. But she never complained, never once let Molly see the fatigue or despair in her eyes. Sitting by her sister's bedside in the stillness of late night, Iris found herself once again pulled back into the memory of that terrible night 15 years earlier. She had been only 12 then. That night, She had stayed over at a friend's house because the birthday party had gone too late. At 3 in the morning, the police knocked on the door, and her whole world collapsed in the space of a few short sentences. They told her that her house had caught fire, and her parents had not survived. Iris and Molly, who had been only 7 at the time and asleep in separate rooms at a friend's house, became orphans in a single night. They were sent into the city's foster care system and passed through 6 different families over 6 years, because no one wanted to keep 2 children together when the financial burden was too heavy. But Iris never left her sister. In her heart, she had made a promise to her mother, even though she had not been there when she died, that she would protect Molly at any cost, with her whole life, if that was what it required. At 5 in the morning, Iris left Molly's hospital, went home, and managed only 3 short hours of sleep before the alarm dragged her back up and sent her to Mount Sinai to begin another shift. The very first thing she heard when she arrived was the voice of the department head announcing that, "Bellamy, you have been assigned to the VIP case on the 12th floor, patient Victor Kovac." Iris frowned and said plainly that she did not like VIP cases. The department head replied that no one liked them, but she was the best nurse in the department, and they had asked for the best. She let out a tired sigh, accepted the assignment, picked up the chart, and stepped into the elevator. The 12th floor felt like an entirely different world from the rest of the hospital. Bodyguards in black suits stationed everywhere. The air so tense it was almost suffocating, every step watched by wary eyes. And standing just outside the hospital room door was the man she had seen the day before, his eyes cold as ice, his angular face giving away nothing at all. He looked her over from head to toe with a sharp, appraising stare, then asked if she was the new nurse. Iris answered in a calm, professional voice, introducing herself as Iris Bellamy, and saying that she would be responsible for Mr. Kovac's care. Winston corrected her at once, saying, "That is my father," and then asked whether he was going to wake up, his voice trying to sound cold but unable to hide the fear buried underneath. Iris looked straight into those eyes without flinching, without fear like so many others who crumbled beneath that terrifying gaze, and answered that she would do everything she could. No empty promises, no hollow words of comfort, only the bare truth and the determination of a nurse devoted to her work. Winston studied her for a few seconds more, as if trying to read the person standing before him, then gave a short nod and turned away without another word. Iris stepped into the room, looked at the old man lying motionless in bed with machines and tubes connected to every part of him, and began her work. She had no idea that her life had just turned in an entirely new direction, that this hospital room was about to become the place where her fate would intertwine with the fate of the most powerful family in New York. A full week had passed since the day Iris was assigned to the 12th floor to care for Victor Kovac, and he remained sunk in a coma so deep it was as though his soul had already left his body, leaving behind only a shell kept alive by machines and medication. Iris worked without pause at the bedside of this extraordinary patient. She watched every reading on the monitor, wrote down even the smallest change in her personal notebook, checked every drop of fluid flowing into the old man's body. She was the kind of nurse who never overlooked anything. Her almost obsessive precision had saved many patients in the past because she noticed warning signs that others ignored, and for that very reason, she began to see things in this case that made no sense. Victor's test results did not match any illness she had ever studied in a medical textbook. There were no signs of a stroke, no evidence of a heart attack, no brain tumor or any injury inside the skull, no infection, no virus attacking his immune system. But what troubled Iris most was that Victor's vital functions continued to decline steadily each day, as though something unseen were quietly feeding on his life from within. She held the thick stack of medical records in her hands, frowning as she read each page, each line, again and again. Under her breath, she murmured to herself that none of this made sense, that there was no medical logic that could explain this condition. Bradley came to visit his father every day at exactly 3 in the afternoon, not 1 minute early and not 1 minute late. His punctuality was so exact that Iris felt she could set a clock by the schedule of this devoted son's visits. He always carried a bottle of water in his coat pocket, and when Iris asked about it, Bradley explained with the gentlest smile that it was the mineral water his father liked to drink, and that he hoped when he woke up he would be able to have something familiar right away. Iris nodded at the time and thought nothing more of it, because it seemed like a loving gesture from a son to his father. But after several days of watching, she began to notice a strange pattern. Every time Bradley came to visit, he asked to be left alone with his father for about 15 to 20 minutes. He would say, "Please give me a little private time with him, all right." And Iris always respected that because she understood the pain of a family member standing beside someone they loved who lay motionless. But what sent a chill through her was that every single time Bradley left, Victor's numbers were a little worse than they had been before the visit. The first time, she thought it was only a coincidence. The second time, suspicion began to stir in her mind. By the third time, she was almost certain that something was wrong, something happening right in front of her eyes. Iris decided to speak with Dr. Pemberton, the physician in charge of Victor's case, a 55-year-old man with graying hair and a face that always looked tense, as if he were carrying the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. She told him that she had a few concerns about Mr. Kovac's test results. Pemberton looked up from the pile of paperwork on his desk, his eyes avoiding her direct gaze, and asked what concerns. Iris explained that the readings did not match any known illness, that Mr. Kovac had no history of heart disease, no signs of stroke or any kind of brain injury, yet he remained in a deep coma while his bodily functions continued to deteriorate, and that this was highly unusual and needed a deeper investigation. Pemberton cleared his throat, stood up too quickly, as though he wanted to escape the conversation as fast as possible, and said, "Miss Bellamy, there are cases medicine cannot explain. Just continue monitoring the patient. I will look into it further." Then he hurried away, leaving Iris standing there alone with more questions than answers. She watched his retreating figure and replayed every small detail of the conversation in her mind. The way he avoided her eyes, as though he did not dare face the truth. The way he rushed off as if he were running from something. The way he refused to discuss a case this unusual in any real depth. He was hiding something. Iris was sure of it. That night, instead of going back to her tiny apartment in Queens as she usually did, Iris stayed at the hospital. She sat alone in the empty nurse's lounge, surrounded by a mountain of lab reports and charts tracking Victor's condition over the past week. She compared every number, every curve on the graph, every slight shift in his liver function, kidney function, and heart readings. Then she took out her personal notebook and began writing down what she had observed, day by day. On the first day, Bradley visited at 3 in the afternoon, and Victor's kidney function dropped by 5% afterward. On the second day, Bradley came at the same exact time, and abnormalities appeared in Victor's liver readings. On the third day, Bradley came again, and Victor's heartbeat weakened noticeably. On the fourth day, Bradley did not come because of an important business meeting, and strangely enough, Victor's numbers remained completely stable for the entire 24 hours. On the fifth day, Bradley returned, and immediately the readings began to fall again. Iris stared at the lines she had just written, and a coldness spread through her as though someone had poured a bucket of ice water over her body. This was not coincidence. This was a pattern, as clear as daylight, and there was only one reasonable explanation for that pattern. Someone was deliberately making Victor weaker. Someone was slowly poisoning him right in front of everyone's eyes. Iris closed her notebook, her brown eyes lifting toward the dark hallway beyond the door. She needed proof. She needed certainty before she could do anything, and she was going to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking her own life to stand against the most powerful family in New York. On the 8th night since Iris had begun recording the strange patterns in her notebook, she decided she couldn't wait any longer. At 11 that night, her shift should have ended long before, but she asked to stay for extra hours, saying she wanted to earn more money to help pay her sister's medical bills. No one found that suspicious because everyone knew how hard her life was. But the truth was that Iris needed to confirm the suspicion that had been gnawing at her mind for days. She hid herself in the dark corner at the far end of the 12th floor hallway, where the light did not reach, but she could still see Victor's room through the clear glass. At that hour, the bodyguards were fewer in number, only 2 men standing watch at the head of the hall, and they paid no attention to the small nurse folded into the darkness. Time moved with painful slowness, each minute stretching into what felt like hours. At 2 in the morning, when the hospital had sunk into silence and most of the staff had gone home, footsteps sounded through the empty corridor. Iris held her breath, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Bradley appeared at the far end of the hall. He was wearing a black coat and moving lightly, like a cat stalking prey. He looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching, then slipped into his father's room after nodding to the 2 bodyguards as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Iris moved closer, hiding behind the corner of the wall, her eyes never leaving the glass for even a second. Through it, she saw Bradley standing beside Victor's bed, looking down at his comatose father with a face completely devoid of feeling. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out something small. Not the familiar bottle of mineral water he brought each afternoon, but a tiny glass vial no bigger than a little finger. Bradley removed the cap and carefully poured a small amount of fine white powder into the intravenous line connected to his father's arm. Iris felt as though lightning had struck her under a clear sky. Her entire body went rigid. Her breath caught in her throat. She had just witnessed an attempted murder unfold right before her eyes. Not in a movie, not in a novel, but in brutal reality only a few feet away. She stepped back, her heart slamming against her ribs, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stay upright. Her first instinct was to run, to call the police, to find someone, anyone, to help. But her mind moved faster than her fear, analyzing the situation with astonishing clarity. Call the police? The Kovac family controlled half of New York City. They had ties to the most powerful people in the city. They could buy anyone, from police officers to judges. Tell Winston? She had no proof except what she had just seen. Only the word of a dirt-poor nurse from Queens against the younger brother of the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. Who would believe her? She needed hard evidence, something undeniable. The next day, Iris acted with the eerie calm of someone who had already decided to risk everything. When Bradley came to visit as usual at exactly 3 p.m, she greeted him with a smile as she always did, giving away no sign that anything was wrong. She waited until he had spent about 20 minutes alone with his father and left, then slipped into the room under the pretense of checking the patient's condition. The bottle of mineral water Bradley had left behind was still on the table by the bed, just as it always was. Iris took a small test tube from the pocket of her white coat and carefully poured some of the water into it, then placed the bottle back exactly where it had been, as though no one had touched it. Her hands were trembling. She knew that if she were caught, she could lose her job, or far worse, she could lose her life at the hands of people willing to kill to protect their secret. But she did not stop. 2 days later, Iris went to a private laboratory on the outskirts of the city, a place where no one knew who she was, a place with no connection to Mount Sinai or the Kovac family. She told the intake clerk that she wanted this water sample tested for toxins. The clerk quoted her a price of $800, nearly as much as 1 month's rent, a crushing amount for someone working 70 hours a week just to pay her sister's hospital bills. But Iris did not hesitate for even a second. She said she would pay it. The 3 days of waiting for the results were the longest 3 days of Iris's life. For 3 days, she still went to the hospital and worked as though nothing had changed, smiling at Bradley when he came to visit his father, checking Victor's vitals, changing bandages, adjusting medication, pretending she knew nothing about the crime unfolding right in front of her. For 3 nights, she lay on her bed in her cramped apartment in Queens, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, asking herself what she was doing. She was only a poor nurse drowning in debt. What power did she have to stand against the most powerful family in New York? But then she would think of Victor, the old man lying motionless in his hospital bed, utterly defenseless, being poisoned day after day by the very son he loved. She thought of her own parents, the ones who had died in the fire 15 years earlier, with no one arriving in time to save them, no one there to protect them. No, she decided. She would not allow an innocent man to die if she had any power to stop it, no matter what it cost her. On the 3rd day, the test results arrived. Iris opened the envelope in the nurse's lounge when no one else was around, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tear the paper. The bold words on the report struck her eyes like hammer blows. Thallium sulfate, concentration 0.3 milligrams per liter, poison. In the bottle of water Bradley brought every single day. She had been right. Iris dropped into the chair, her legs no longer strong enough to hold her, her whole body trembling beyond control. What was she supposed to do now? If she went to the police, they would either refuse to believe her or be bought off. There was only one person powerful enough to handle this, and that was Winston Kovac. But she would have to tell him that his own brother, the brother he had protected all his life, was trying to kill their father. Would he believe her, or would he think she was insane and have her dealt with the way the underworld always dealt with people who became a problem? Iris looked down at the laboratory report in her hand. This was her only evidence, the only weapon she had to stand against the Kovac family. She had no choice left except to face the man with the cold eyes herself. At 11 that night, the hallway on the 12th floor lay submerged in a thick, unbroken silence. Only the steady rhythm of medical machines drifted out from the patient rooms, while dim lights spilled weakly across the cold white tile. Winston stood alone in front of the glass wall of his father's room, staring inside where Victor lay motionless beneath a web of tubes and wires. For more than an hour, his eyes never left the frail outline of his aging father. His face revealed nothing, cold and still as carved stone, but anyone who looked closely into those eyes would have seen an entire storm raging beneath them, the pain and helplessness of a son watching his father fade while being powerless to stop it. Iris approached from the far end of the hallway, her footsteps soft against the tile, the lab report sealed inside her scrub pocket. Clutched all day as though it were the only weapon she had, Winston did not turn around. But she knew he had sensed her presence the moment she stepped out of the elevator. He spoke without taking his eyes off his father, his voice cold and empty of emotion, saying that Miss Bellamy, your shift ended a long time ago. Iris stopped a few steps behind him. She drew in a slow breath to steady herself, then answered that she knew, but she needed to speak with him, and that it was important. Winston turned then, one brow lifting with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He asked if it was about his father. Iris looked straight into those eyes without flinching, without looking away, and said in a firm voice that it was about the person trying to kill his father. Silence spread through the hallway like a heavy blanket. Winston's eyes darkened like a sky before a storm. He stared at her with the sharp, measuring gaze of a man long accustomed to separating truth from lies in a world built on deception. He told her she had 60 seconds, his voice cold as ice and carrying the unspoken warning that if she was wasting his time, the consequences would be severe. Iris took a breath and began. She told him that his father was being poisoned with thallium, a colorless, odorless toxin that caused cumulative damage over time and was extremely difficult to detect through ordinary tests. Winston said nothing. His face might as well have been cut from granite. Iris went on, her voice growing steadier as she said that the person doing it was his brother, Bradley Kovac. The air seemed to harden around them, as though the entire hallway had stopped breathing. Winston took one step toward her, his eyes like twin blades, and the distance between them narrowed until Iris could almost feel the danger radiating off him. In a low voice thick with threat, he asked her what exactly she had just said. Iris did not retreat even an inch. She held his gaze and explained that she had been tracking his father's vital signs for the past week, that every time Bradley came to visit, Victor's condition worsened, and that she had seen Bradley with her own eyes putting something into the intravenous line at 2 a.m. Winston asked whether she had proof. His voice remained cold, but Iris could sense something else boiling beneath the ice. She reached into her pocket, took out the envelope, handed it to him, and said that it contained the toxicology results from the water bottle Bradley brought every day. Thallium sulfate at a concentration of 0.3 milligrams per liter, enough to kill a man in a matter of weeks if given continuously. Winston snatched the envelope from her hand and opened it. His eyes swept across each line, and every second that passed felt as heavy as an hour while Iris stood there waiting for his reaction. His face did not change. It remained as cold and unreadable as stone. But Iris saw his hand tighten around the paper until it crumpled, his knuckles whitening from the force. He lifted his head and looked at her, then said in a voice of frozen steel that she understood what would happen to her if she was wrong. Iris did not shake. She did not show fear. She answered that she did understand, that she knew who he was, that she knew what his family was capable of doing to people who caused trouble, but that she also knew an innocent man was lying in that bed, being poisoned by his own son, and she would not stay silent and watch him die. Winston asked her why she cared. His father was only one patient among the hundreds she treated. What made him so special that she was willing to risk her life for him? Iris looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed someone to see the pain buried deep inside her heart. She said that it was because she had lost her parents when she was young, because no one had been there to save them when they needed help, and because she had sworn she would never let that happen to anyone else if she had the power to stop it. Silence settled over them again, but this silence was different. It no longer felt sharp and threatening. It was the silence of understanding. Winston looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time since they had met, not as some insignificant nurse carrying out assigned duties, but as a human being with her own story, her own wounds, her own courage, something he had rarely seen in anyone in his world. He said that she was different from the people he had known. Iris answered that she would take that as a compliment, and a faint smile touched the corner of her mouth even though there was nothing in the moment that should have inspired one. Winston folded the report and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he said that from this moment on, she was not to leave this floor, that she was under his protection. Iris blinked in surprise and asked if he believed her. Winston turned away and looked back toward his father's room. He answered that he did not trust anyone, but he would find the truth. And if his brother had truly done this, he left the sentence unfinished, hanging in the air like a dark promise. But the way he clenched his fist until his knuckles cracked said everything that did not need to be spoken. A week passed after the night Iris handed the evidence to Winston, and throughout those 7 days, nothing happened, at least not on the surface. Winston did not act at once the way Iris had expected. He was a man of calculation, a man who had survived and ruled in the underworld through caution and patience, and he needed absolute certainty before moving against his own brother. During that week, he had Bradley watched around the clock, every action recorded, every meeting noted, every phone call traced. He personally reviewed every piece of evidence Iris had given him and compared it against what his men uncovered. He consulted outside toxicology experts, people with no ties to the Kovac family and no chance of being bought. Everything matched. Every piece fit together like a perfect portrait of betrayal. His brother, the boy he had protected all his life, the child he had once carried on his back through dangerous streets, was trying to kill their father with a poison that worked slowly and cruelly. The day of judgment came on a gray afternoon, when Bradley walked into the hospital with an authorization form in his hand, and the family lawyer following behind him like a legal bodyguard. He went straight to Victor's room, his face arranged into an expression of grief and concern, and called out to Winston, saying he needed to have a serious talk. Inside the room, Winston was already standing beside his father's bed, his face as expressionless as stone. Beside him stood Iris in her familiar nurse's uniform, Dr. Pemberton with a look of unusual strain on his face, and 2 trusted bodyguards motionless in the corners like carved figures. Bradley stepped inside, completely unaware of the heavy atmosphere filling the room, or perhaps choosing to ignore it, and began his performance with the perfectly rehearsed look of a worried son. He said, "Brother, I have thought about this so much. Father is suffering terribly. The doctors say he may never wake up again." Then he held out the paper and said this was the humane choice, to let their father go peacefully instead of forcing him to endure meaningless suffering any longer. Winston looked at the paper in his brother's hand. It was a request to remove life support, a petition to end their father's life with a signature. He said in a flat voice that, "You want father dead." Bradley hurried to correct him, his voice trembling with carefully staged emotion, saying that he wanted father not to suffer anymore, asking how Winston could think he wanted this, reminding him that he was their father's son too. Winston said nothing. He took a pen from his pocket and placed it over the paper, as though he were about to sign. Bradley smiled, a flash of triumph so quick that only Iris, standing in the corner, caught it, the smile of a man about to reach his goal after so many weeks of waiting. The pen was almost touching the page, when a voice rang through the room and tore the moment apart. "Stop." Iris stepped forward, her voice carrying across the room with a force even she had not known she possessed. Everyone turned to look at her. Bradley frowned in irritation and demanded to know who she thought she was, saying that this was family business and some insignificant nurse had no right to interfere. Iris did not answer him. She walked straight up to Bradley and yanked the expensive sunglasses off his face. "Your eyes are bone dry," she said, her voice cold as steel. A deathly silence fell over the room like a heavy curtain. Iris continued. She said she had worked in that hospital for 6 years. She had seen hundreds of people sign forms to end treatment for the ones they loved, and every one of them had cried, whether they were the strongest men or the hardest women. But he, the son who was about to sign his own father's death warrant, did not have a single tear in his eyes. Bradley took a step back, and the color began to drain from his face. He stammered that she was crazy, that everyone showed emotion differently, that not everyone could cry. Winston stepped forward and threw the lab report envelope down onto the table in front of Bradley. In a voice like ice, he said, "Then explain this, little brother." Bradley looked at the envelope, and his face went even paler when he realized what it was. Winston went on. "Thallium, in the bottle of water you brought every day. Enough to kill a man in a matter of weeks if given over time." Bradley tried to fight back, asking whether Winston would really believe a nurse over his own brother. Winston corrected him with a voice sharp as a blade, saying that you are my half-brother, and I don't believe anyone. I believe evidence. Bradley looked at Winston, then at Iris, then at the test results, then around the room like an animal driven into a corner. Then suddenly he laughed. A cold, broken, unhinged sound, like glass shattering across stone. He said that at last you figured it out. Too late, dear brother. Winston asked why. Just one word, simple, but carrying all the pain and incomprehension inside it. Bradley screamed back. Why? Because all his life he had lived in Winston's shadow, because their father looked at Winston as though he were the son, while Bradley was nothing but a bastard child taken in out of pity, because Winston had everything, and he had nothing. Winston said that you had a family. You had me. Bradley shouted that he did not need Winston's pity, that he had never needed it. The 2 bodyguards moved in and seized Bradley. He fought like a wild animal caught in a trap, thrashing and raging, still screaming that Winston would regret this, swearing that he would regret it. Just before they dragged him from the room, Bradley turned back and looked at Winston with green eyes burning with hatred and said that this is not over, brother. It is not over. The door slammed shut. Bradley's shouting still echoed down the hallway for a few moments, then faded into the distance and was gone. Winston stood there without moving, in silence, staring at the place where his brother had been standing only seconds before. His face remained unreadable, but Iris could see that something inside this man of steel had shattered. For the first time since meeting him, she saw the crack in the wall he had spent so many years building around himself. The crack of an older brother who had just lost the younger brother he had protected all his life. 2 weeks had passed since the day Bradley was restrained and dragged from his father's hospital room amid screams thick with hatred. And throughout those 14 days, Victor was given proper detoxification treatment under the close supervision of a new medical team personally chosen by Winston. The old man's 62-year-old body began to recover, slowly but surely, like an aging warrior refusing to surrender to death. His liver and kidney function started to improve. His heartbeat grew steadier, and for the first time in weeks, the doctors were able to breathe with cautious relief. Iris monitored every reading each day, carefully recording even the smallest changes. She had hardly left the 12th floor since the truth came to light, partly because of her professional duty, partly because she felt she had become part of this story whether she wanted to or not. Winston was the same. He slept every night on the stiff sofa outside the hallway, refusing to return to the penthouse even though Frank DeLuca urged him many times. He wanted to stay near his father. He wanted to be the first to know if anything changed. Late one night, when the hallway stood completely empty and only the steady sounds of medical machinery drifted out from the patient rooms, Iris stepped out of Victor's room with a cup of hot coffee in her hand. She walked over to where Winston was sitting and offered it to him, telling him that he should get some rest. Winston took the cup, looked at her, and answered that she should do the same. Iris smiled faintly and said she was used to staying awake at night. Winston looked back at her, his eyes tired but still sharp, and said that he was too. They looked at each other in silence. Neither of them smiled, yet something softened between them, a kind of understanding that did not need words, between 2 people who had already endured too much together over the past few weeks. On the 15th day, at 6 a.m, just as the first light of dawn began slipping through the hospital windows, Iris was checking the monitor as usual when she suddenly noticed the readings shifting in an unusual way. The heartbeat was rising. The brain activity was growing stronger. The signs she had been waiting for through all those long weeks were finally there. She turned toward the bed, and her heart seemed to stop for one breath when she saw Victor Kovac opening his eyes, his aged gaze blinking as he struggled to adjust to the light after so many days swallowed by darkness. She called his name and asked if he could hear her, her voice trembling with emotion. Victor blinked several times, his lips moving weakly, and in a hoarse, fragile voice, he asked where he was. Iris hit the call button for the doctor, then ran into the hallway and called out that Mr. Kovac, your father is awake. Winston shot up from the sofa as though released by a spring, his eyes wide, then rushed into the room with a speed Iris had never seen from him before. He called out for his father, and his voice cracked, and for the first time Iris heard real emotion in the voice of this man of steel. Victor turned his head toward the sound, and his clouded eyes slowly brightened as he recognized the familiar face of his eldest son. He spoke Winston's name, his voice weak but full of love. Winston dropped to his knees beside the bed and clasped his father's frail hand in both of his strong ones. He said that his father was awake, his voice thick with emotion. This was the first time Iris had seen him lose that perfect control he always carried, his eyes rimmed red as though on the verge of tears. Victor coughed lightly a few times, then asked in a weak voice how long he had been lying there. Winston answered that it had been 3 weeks, that he had been in a coma for 3 weeks. Victor closed his eyes for a moment, as though trying to absorb the truth, then opened them again and asked the question Winston had dreaded most. He asked where Bradley was. A heavy silence spread through the room like a suffocating blanket. Winston did not know what to say. He looked down at his father's hand and couldn't bring himself to meet his eyes. Iris stepped back toward the door, wanting to give them space to face this painful truth alone. Victor studied his son's face, felt the silence stretch too long, and slowly understood that something terrible had happened. He asked what he had done. Winston tightened his grip on his father's hand and said that he needed to rest, that they could talk about it later. But Victor would not accept that. His voice suddenly rang out with the old authority of the Mafia boss who had once made the entire East Coast tremble, and he ordered Winston to tell him now. Winston closed his eyes, drew in a deep breath, then said in a low, heavy voice that Bradley had poisoned him with thallium, that he had wanted him dead. The room seemed to freeze. Time itself appeared to stop in that moment. Victor stared at Winston, his old eyes wide with disbelief, and repeated in a trembling voice that his son had wanted to kill him. Winston said that he was sorry, that he should have realized it sooner. Victor said nothing for a long time. He turned his face away and stared up at the white hospital ceiling, and Iris saw a tear slide from the corner of his lined old eye. Not the tear of physical pain, but the tear of a man completely shattered. He had spent his whole life building a family, protecting his children, and the very child he loved had driven the knife into his back. Victor whispered, as though speaking only to himself, asking where he had gone wrong, asking what he had done wrong with the boy. Winston had no answer, because there are questions in this world that no one can answer. After a while, Victor turned back to Winston and asked who had discovered it. Winston lifted his head and looked toward the doorway, where Iris was standing. He said that it was her father, the nurse named Iris Bellamy. Victor motioned for Iris to come closer. She stepped to the bedside, unsure what she could possibly say in a moment like this. Victor looked at her for a long time, with the sharpness still lingering in the eyes of the man he once had been, then took her hand and told her that she had saved his life, that the Kovac family owed her a debt they could never fully repay. Iris shook her head and said she had only been doing her job. Victor looked straight into her eyes and said no, that she had done what no one else dared to do, that she had faced the truth when everyone else turned away. Then he released her hand, looked over at Winston, and said in a voice laden with meaning that he should keep her close, that she was one of the rare few people worth trusting in a world built on lies. At the very moment Victor awoke and learned the heartbreaking truth about his youngest son, dozens of miles away, beneath the ground in Brooklyn, Bradley Kovac sat inside the secret basement the Kovac family had used for 3 decades to deal with traitors from within, stubborn debtors, and people who knew too many secrets. This was not an ordinary prison with laws and procedures. It was the family's private hell, a place where people could disappear and no one would ever know. The windowless concrete room was cold as a tomb, its gray walls stained with the damp scars of time, while the fluorescent light overhead flickered without pause, casting wild, ghost-like shadows across the walls as though mocking the prisoner. Bradley sat on a rusted iron chair, his hands cuffed tightly to its frame. He was no longer the polished Bradley of former days, with his expensive suits and charming smile that won everyone over. Stubble had spread across the face that had once been carefully groomed. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep and lack of light. His features had grown noticeably thinner after 2 weeks of confinement in darkness. But his green eyes, the eyes he had inherited from the mother who abandoned him when he was small, still burned with undiminished hatred. The heavy steel door groaned open with a sharp, metallic screech, and Winston stepped into the room wearing the same familiar air of authority. The 2 brothers looked at each other across the room, one standing in the weak light spilling in from the hallway, the other sitting inside the darkness of captivity. Bradley gave a mocking laugh, the sound echoing through the empty room like something rising out of hell, and asked whether his brother had come to beg forgiveness. Winston did not answer at once. He dragged a chair over and sat down across from his brother, looking straight into those green eyes blazing with hatred, then said that father had awakened. Bradley froze for a brief second. The news clearly startled him, because by his calculations Victor should have been dead by now, but he recovered quickly, shrugged with cold indifference, and said that was a shame. Winston asked whether he felt no regret at all. Bradley lifted his head high, his arrogance untouched despite the fact that he sat there in chains, and answered that regret. No. The only thing he regretted was that he had not succeeded. Winston looked at his brother, looked at the child he had once carried on his back through dangerous streets, the boy he had taught to ride a bicycle in the courtyard, the child he had shielded from the beatings of street thugs when they were young, and he couldn't understand how that boy had become the man now sitting in front of him. He asked why, saying he had given him everything, a position in the company, money, a home, everything he had wanted. Bradley cut him off, his voice venomous as a serpent, saying that given him everything. No. Winston had handed things down to him like favors, and there was a difference. Because everything he had ever received was because Winston pitied him, not because he had deserved it. Winston said that he was his brother. Bradley answered one word at a time, each one slicing like a blade, saying that he was the bastard child they had taken in, that his mother had left when he was only 5, that his father had raised him out of pity and not out of love, while Winston had always been the cherished heir, the prince cradled from birth, and Bradley had been nothing more than decoration for their perfect family. Winston said that was not the truth. Bradley shouted back that it was his truth, that Winston would never understand what it meant to stand in darkness and watch someone else shine, that he would never know what it felt like to be forgotten, to be treated as though he did not exist in his own family. Silence filled the room for a long while, broken only by the steady flicker of the fluorescent light. Winston rose to his feet and said that Bradley would be taken to court, in public, and tried like an ordinary citizen under the law. Bradley burst into laughter, the sound echoing through the cellar, and said that Winston would never dare do that he would never allow the family's secrets to be exposed before the public. Winston answered in a voice stripped of all emotion, saying that father had already decided that this empire would become a clean empire, and that it would begin by handling Bradley according to the law instead of the ways of the underworld. Winston turned and walked toward the door. Bradley shouted after him that he would regret it, swearing that he would regret this decision. The steel door slammed shut, the sound cracking through the confined room like thunder. Bradley sat there in the dark, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with rage he could barely contain. But then he calmed, his breathing slowly evened out, and a smile began to spread across his mouth, the smile of a man who still held one last card in his hand. He bent down, hooked his finger into the sole of his shoe, and pulled out a small knife with a blade only about 2 inches long, hidden carefully inside. Bradley had bribed one of the guards before he was ever captured. Right after he began his plan to poison his father, he had already prepared a backup plan in case everything fell apart. That guard had hidden the knife inside Bradley's shoe just before he was taken down into the basement. Bradley's smile widened further as he began scraping the blade against the edge of the handcuffs. Slowly, patiently, methodically, the same way he had patiently poisoned his father for weeks. In the darkness, he whispered that this was not over, brother. He would come for him, and this time only one of them would walk away alive. On the night before Bradley was to be transferred to federal prison to await public trial under Victor's orders, the secret basement beneath Brooklyn lay in deathly silence at 2 a.m, when most of the guards had fallen asleep and only a few remained on the night shift. The guard Bradley had bribed in advance appeared at the cell door exactly as promised. He unlocked the steel door and said in a hurried whisper to move fast, that he had shut off the cameras for only 5 minutes. Bradley stepped out of the dark room that had held him for 2 weeks, the handcuffs already cut free with the small knife he had patiently sharpened over many nights, the blade still clenched tight in his hand. He thanked the guard in a voice cold as ice, then without the slightest hesitation, he drove the knife into the man's throat. Blood sprayed out like water from a broken pipe. The guard collapsed onto the concrete floor without even managing a cry. No witness, no trace. No one knew Bradley had escaped. He took the gun from the guard's body, checked the magazine, then vanished into the black Manhattan night like a blood-hungry ghost hunting its prey. 3 days later, in the penthouse on the 58th floor of Kovac Tower, at 11 that night, Winston knew Bradley would come for him. He had read the report about the escape. He had seen the guard's body with the knife wound driven through the throat. He understood his brother better than anyone, and he knew Bradley would not stop until one of them stopped breathing. He did not run. He waited. That evening, he gave the entire security team an unusual night off. The vast penthouse became empty in a way that felt almost sinister. Only Frank DeLuca remained, and Winston ordered Frank to stay downstairs in the lobby. Frank protested fiercely, saying he couldn't leave the boss alone while a murderer was out there in hiding. Winston looked straight into the eyes of the most loyal guard he had ever had and said that this was an order. If he did not come down within 1 hour, Frank was to call the police. Not family men, but real police. Federal agents. Frank understood. The boss wanted to end this his own way, with one final confrontation between brothers and no one else allowed to interfere. At 11:47, the chime of the private elevator shattered the silence of the penthouse. Winston stood by the glass wall looking out over Manhattan blazing below with city lights. His back turned toward the elevator as though he were waiting for an ordinary guest, an unfinished glass of whiskey in his hand. The elevator doors opened with their familiar sound, and Bradley stepped into the penthouse where he had grown up, a gun held firmly in his hand, his green eyes burning with madness like the eyes of a wild animal driven into a corner with nothing left to lose. He asked if his brother was not surprised. Winston turned slowly to face him, his voice unnaturally calm, and said that he knew Bradley would come. The only question had been when. Bradley looked around the empty penthouse and said that Winston had sent all the guards away, that he had wanted this meeting. Winston answered that he wanted to give his brother one last chance. Bradley laughed loudly, the sound wild and broken, echoing through the huge penthouse like something rising out of hell, and asked, "A chance? Did Winston really think he had come here to be forgiven?" He raised the gun and aimed it straight at Winston's chest, ordering him to turn and look at him because he wanted to see his face when he died. Winston set the whiskey glass down on the table and turned fully toward his brother. There was not a trace of fear in his eyes. He said that Bradley could still stop this, right now, and that he would help him. Bradley screamed at him not to pretend to be noble, then pulled the trigger. Winston threw himself aside with the instincts of a man who had survived countless purges. But the bullet still tore through his left shoulder. Blood burst out. He fell onto the marble floor, yet his hand still managed to reach the gun hidden beneath the table. Bradley fired again. The second bullet hit Winston in the chest. He heard the crack of a rib breaking, and the pain ripped through him like fire. But Winston still fired back, one single shot, and it struck Bradley in the stomach. Both men collapsed to the floor, their blood mingling on the white marble, only a few feet apart like two warriors fallen on the same battlefield. Bradley tried to crawl toward his brother, still gripping the gun even as blood kept pouring from the wound in his abdomen. He muttered that they would die together. Winston forced himself upright, his back against the leg of the sofa, the wound in his chest spreading through his black suit, his breathing growing heavier with each second, and he said, "No, Bradley." With the last strength left in him, Bradley raised the gun again, the barrel aimed straight at his brother's head, and said that they would meet in hell. The gunshot cracked through the night, but it did not come from Bradley's weapon. Frank DeLuca stood at the elevator entrance, a Glock still smoking in his hand. He had not obeyed the boss's order. He had come up because the instincts of a bodyguard who had served faithfully for 20 years told him he couldn't leave the boss alone with a madman. Frank's bullet tore through Bradley's wrist. The gun flew out of his hand, and Bradley collapsed with a scream of pain. Frank rushed to Winston's side, calling for the boss over and over, his voice filled with panic. Winston whispered with his fading breath, telling Frank to call an ambulance, for both of them. His eyes slowly drifted shut as blood continued to pour from his wounds. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was his brother's face on the other side of the room, no longer twisted by wild hatred as it had been before, but emptied of everything, and perhaps, only perhaps, marked by the faintest shadow of regret that had come too late. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night in the penthouse on the 58th floor. 2 weeks in which Winston had drifted through the darkness of a coma, while doctors and nurses fought day by day, hour by hour, to keep him tethered to this world. At Mount Sinai Hospital, in the same intensive care room on the 12th floor where Victor had once lain, Winston now rested on the hospital bed with machines and tubes connected to every part of him, the steady beeping of the monitor the only sound confirming that he was still alive. Then one morning, Winston opened his eyes. First, he saw the white ceiling above him, then heard the regular beeping of the heart monitor, then felt the familiar scent of antiseptic filling his lungs, and finally, as his vision slowly sharpened, he saw a pair of honey-brown eyes, looking at him with a calm so strange it almost did not belong in a hospital room. Iris said that he was awake, her voice so composed it was as if he had only risen from an ordinary afternoon nap, rather than returned from the edge of death after taking 2 bullets through his body. Winston tried to speak, but his throat was so dry and raw that no sound came out. Iris lifted a glass of water to his lips and told him to drink slowly, that he had been unconscious for 2 weeks. He swallowed a few mouthfuls of cool water, the sensation of it running down his throat like a stream in the middle of the desert, then asked in a hoarse voice how Bradley was. Iris answered that Bradley was still alive and was being held at the federal prison hospital while recovering from his wounds before going to trial. Winston closed his eyes. He did not know whether he felt relief because his brother was still alive, or disappointment that everything had fallen so far. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. He was too exhausted to sort through his own emotions. Iris continued speaking while checking the readings on the machine. She explained that he had been gravely injured, that one bullet had gone through his left shoulder, while the other had missed his heart by only a few millimeters, that he had lost a great deal of blood, and that the doctors said his survival was nothing short of a medical miracle. Winston asked who had cared for him throughout the time he had been unconscious. Iris looked at him, her face as expressionless as ever, and answered that she had volunteered, that she was already used to caring for the patients in his family, and one more had not made much difference. Winston studied her, the familiar ponytail a little loose with strands falling free from working too many hours. The dark circles beneath her brown eyes deep from lack of sleep, the pale blue scrubs wrinkled after a long shift, and he found himself wondering why she was here, why she had chosen to care for him, when she could so easily have stayed far away from this troubled family. He asked if she was not afraid of him. Iris tilted her head, as though the question were strange and not worth much thought, and answered that he was her patient, and she did not judge patients by who they were or what they had done. For the first time in many years, Winston Kovac, the man who commanded the respect of the entire East Coast underworld, did not know what to say in the face of a small nurse from Queens. The hospital room door opened, and Victor Kovac walked in, his steps still slow and slightly unsteady after his recent illness. But his eyes had recovered the sharpness they once possessed. He called out to his son, his voice thick with emotion. Winston answered, "Father." Victor came to the bedside and took his son's hand in his own thin one. The two men looked at each other without speaking, but their eyes said everything. Victor had nearly lost both of his sons within a single month, one because of his own betrayal, and the other because he had tried to save what remained of brotherhood. At last, Victor spoke. He said that Winston should not have faced Bradley alone. Winston answered that he had wanted to give him one last chance. Victor sighed and said that Bradley had betrayed that chance as well. Silence filled the room for a long moment before Victor continued. He said that Bradley would stand public trial as he had decided, but no matter what, he was still his son, and he had failed him. He had not seen the pain Bradley had carried all those years living in the shadow of his older brother. Winston said nothing. Because there are things in this world that cannot be argued away, mistakes that cannot be undone, wounds that time can never heal no matter how many years pass. Victor turned to look at Iris, who was standing quietly in the corner of the room, and called her Miss Bellamy. She answered, "Yes, sir." Victor said that she had saved him, and now she had saved his son as well, that the Kovac family owed her a debt for life, and that it was a debt they could never fully repay. Iris shook her head gently, and said that she had only been doing her job. Victor looked at her for a long moment, with the same eyes that had once seen into the hearts of thousands of people, then said no, that she had done far more than that, and that he hoped she would continue to stay beside his son during his recovery. Iris looked toward Winston. Winston looked back at her. Gray eyes met brown eyes in a moment of silence when neither of them spoke. Yet something in their gaze had changed. An invisible thread had been tied between two people from utterly different worlds. 1 week after Winston woke up, he announced to everyone that he was leaving the hospital and would recover at home. The decision sparked fierce objections from the doctors, because his wounds had not fully healed, from Frank DeLuca, because he feared for the boss's safety, and even from Victor, who did not want his son risking his health. But no one could stop Winston Kovac once he had made up his mind about something. The doctors warned that he needed care around the clock, that the wound in his chest had not fully closed, and that if complications developed, the consequences could be very serious. Winston answered that he would hire a private nurse. Then he looked over at Iris, who was standing in the corner of the room, and said, "Miss Bellamy, I want you to work for me at the penthouse." Iris folded her arms across her chest, her brown eyes meeting his without the slightest hesitation, and said that she was not a private nurse for rich people. Winston replied that he would pay her 10 times her current salary. Iris shook her head and said that money was not the issue. Winston asked what the issue was. Then, Iris looked straight into his eyes and told him that she did not want to be drawn any deeper into his world, that she had already seen enough of what happened inside his family, and that she did not want to become part of it. Winston was silent for a moment, then said that she had entered his world the moment she decided to save his father, and that he was not asking because of money, he was asking because he trusted her. Iris lifted a brow and asked whether he trusted her, because he had said himself that he trusted no one. Winston answered that she was the exception. Silence settled over the hospital room for a long moment before Winston drew in a breath and continued. He said that he knew about her sister, Molly, end-stage kidney failure and waiting for a transplant. Iris went rigid. Her voice turned cold as she asked whether he had investigated her. Winston answered bluntly that he investigated everyone who came near him, that it was how he had stayed alive in his world, and that he knew she owed $180,000 in medical bills, that she had been working 70 hours a week to pay it off in installments. Iris asked, in a guarded voice, whether he was using her sister to force her. Winston shook his head and said no, that he was offering to pay all of Molly's medical bills whether Iris accepted the job or not. Iris stared at him in stunned silence, then asked why he would do that. Winston looked at her, and his expression was more sincere than Iris had ever seen it. He said that she had saved his father when no one had asked her to, that she had risked her life for a complete stranger, and that his world did not have many people like her. He was not buying her, he was repaying a debt. Iris did not answer right away. She went back to her small apartment in Queens and thought about it all night long. She lay on her bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, weighing every choice, every possible consequence. The next morning, she got a call from the hospital where Molly was being treated. They told her that a matching kidney donor had been found, and that the surgery could take place the following week. Iris felt her heart break open with emotion. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Molly had waited for that chance for so many years, and now it had appeared all at once like a miracle. Iris called Winston immediately, her voice shaking as she asked what he had done. Winston answered calmly that he had connections with a few hospitals, and they had moved the process along more quickly to find a suitable donor. Iris said that she had not agreed yet. Winston replied that he knew, just as he had told her, whether she accepted or not. Silence stretched across the phone line before Iris finally asked in a choked voice why he was treating her so well. Winston did not answer at once. Then he said in a tone unlike his usual one, "Maybe because you are the first person who ever dared say things to my face without being afraid." Iris laughed softly into the phone and said all right. She would take the job, but she had conditions. Winston told her to name them. Iris said that he had to listen to her about his treatment, that he was not allowed to work before he was fully healed, and that he was not allowed to sneak around without her permission. Winston asked whether she was giving him orders. Iris answered that she was treating him, and there was a difference. For the first time, Iris heard Winston laugh softly over the phone, a sound she had never imagined the man of steel could make, and he said, "All right, deal." At that same moment, Frank DeLuca walked into Winston's hospital room with a face so tense that the lines on his forehead looked deeper than ever. He said, "Boss, we have a problem." Winston asked what it was. Frank reported that his men had spotted someone watching the penthouse for the past 3 days, and there were rumors in the underworld that some of Bradley's former associates were circling, thinking Winston was weak after the shooting, and that this was their chance to seize what they could. Winston clenched his fist. He understood the rule of that world better than anyone. An empire never tolerated a vacuum of power. When the lion was wounded, the hyenas always gathered to wait for their chance to tear it apart. He ordered Frank to tighten security and find out who had been watching them. Frank answered, "Yes, boss," then left to carry out the order. Winston looked out the window where the lights of Manhattan flickered below like a million stars. The war was not over, and new enemies were already lurking in the dark, but this time he was not alone. He had Frank, loyal as ever. He had his father, recovering at last. And he had a nurse from Queens with honey-brown eyes, who had never learned how to be afraid. Iris moved into the penthouse on the 58th floor of Kovac Tower on an afternoon washed in pale sunlight. All her belongings amounted to one small suitcase filled with clothes and 2 boxes of books she had carried with her since her days in the orphanage. The 5,000-square-foot penthouse left her stunned the moment she stepped inside. It was more than 20 times larger than the studio apartment she had lived in out in Queens. Floor-to-ceiling windows opened onto the whole Manhattan skyline, the towers glittering like enormous diamonds. while the modern minimalist interior carried a kind of luxury so understated that she knew each piece probably cost more than a full year of her salary. Winston pointed toward the hallway and told her she would be staying in the guest room on the east side, 2 doors down from his own. Iris looked around at the room he called a guest room, a space larger than the entire apartment she had spent the last 3 years in, and told him that his guest room was bigger than the place she had lived. Winston asked if she did not like it. Iris shook her head and answered honestly that she was simply not used to living like this. And that was how the strangest days of the orphan girl from Queens began. Winston turned out to be the worst patient Iris had ever had in all 6 years of being a nurse. Worse than the most stubborn old men and worse than the most whiny children. On the very first day, she caught him secretly opening his laptop in bed when he was supposed to be resting. She asked what he was doing, and he answered as though it were the most natural thing in the world that he was only checking email. Iris told him that email could wait, but his wounds couldn't. Winston started to explain that she did not understand, that there were important decisions waiting for him. Iris did not say another word. She simply walked over and snapped the laptop shut right in front of him. Winston stared at her, as though she had slapped him across the face in the middle of a crowd. His eyes widened in astonishment, and he said that no one had ever dared do that to him before. Iris folded her arms across her chest, and answered that then he had finally met the right person, and asked whether he wanted to die at his desk, or live long enough to keep working. Silence stretched between them for several tense seconds, and then Winston Kovac, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, the man who could make the entire East Coast underworld tremble, actually listened to a small nurse from Queens. He closed the laptop and lay back down on the bed like a child who had just been scolded by his mother, and Iris could hardly believe her own eyes. In the days that followed, they slowly grew used to each other's presence inside the vast shared space of the penthouse. Every morning, Iris changed Winston's bandages, checked the wounds on his shoulder and chest as they gradually healed, took his blood pressure, and forced him to take his medicine on time, even though he was always trying to avoid it. Winston complained about everything like an overindulged child. He said the medicine tasted bitter. He said resting was unbearably dull. He said if he was not allowed to work, he would lose his mind. Iris looked at him and said bluntly that he was like a 5-year-old. Winston replied that he was 33. Iris shrugged and told him she was talking about his level of maturity, not his age. Winston stared at her as though he couldn't believe she had just said that to him, and then he laughed. Not the cold, polite smile he offered to business partners or enemies, but a real laugh, rough and brief, yet so genuine that Iris could feel it tremble in the air between them. She watched him laugh, and her heart missed a beat, and she told herself at once that this was dangerous. This was ground she should never step onto. One evening, Iris decided to force Winston to watch a movie because, in her mind, resting did not simply mean lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Winston asked what kind of movie this was when he saw the huge television screen. Iris told him it was a superhero movie, and asked if he had really never seen one before. Winston said he did not watch movies. Iris shook her head in disbelief and asked what kind of life that was. Winston answered that it was the kind of life spent building an empire, with no time for pointless entertainment. Iris said nothing more. She just turned on the movie and sat down on the sofa, leaving what she considered a safe distance between them. 2 hours later, Winston sat perfectly still in front of the screen, his eyes locked on the action scenes and the lines of dialogue loaded with meaning. When the movie ended, he said that the main character was interesting. Iris asked whether he had liked it. Winston replied thoughtfully that the character had been betrayed by the people he trusted most, yet he kept fighting instead of collapsing. Iris looked at him and understood that he was really talking about himself, about Bradley, about the pain he never allowed anyone to see. She told him that he would recover too, just like that character. Winston answered that he did not possess the kind of healing powers people had in movies. Iris said that he had her, then immediately realized how that sounded, and quickly added that she meant as his nurse. Winston looked at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to hide something, and repeated, "As my nurse." Iris nodded and said yes, exactly. Silence settled over the room, and both of them knew neither one truly believed that answer. The good news came at the end of the week, when Iris received a call from the hospital telling her that Molly's kidney transplant had been completely successful, that her little sister was recovering well and would soon be discharged. Iris burst into tears the moment she heard the news, tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them, right there in front of Winston. She hurried to wipe them away, and apologized for being unprofessional. Winston told her not to apologize for caring about family. His voice was gentler than it ever was in his colder moments, and he said that it was something he admired about her. Iris looked at him in surprise and asked whether he admired her. Winston said that she was willing to sacrifice everything for her sister, and that it was what he had tried to do for Bradley, though he had failed. Iris shook her head and told him that he had not failed, that he had given his brother everything one brother could possibly give, and that the fact Bradley had not valued it was not Winston's fault. Winston said nothing, but the way he looked at her changed. His eyes no longer held the chill they had carried on the day they first met. There was warmth in them now, softness, as if he had found something he had not even known he had been searching for all this time. 3 weeks had passed since the day Iris moved into the penthouse, and Winston was able to walk again now, though sharp movements still brought him pain. The wounds in his shoulder and chest were healing, slowly but surely. In much the same way, everything between them was changing day by day. That night, Iris couldn't sleep, even though she was lying in the softest bed she had ever known in her life. Her mind kept spinning with thousands of thoughts that refused to settle. She left her room and stepped out onto the broad balcony overlooking all of Manhattan, then sat down in a wicker chair and gazed at the city below, its lights flickering like an endless sea of stars. This city never slept. Just like her, just like Winston, always full of souls lying awake through the night, with worries no one else could see. Winston's voice came from behind her, asking if she couldn't sleep. He stepped onto the balcony in a black robe, holding 2 glasses, his movements still slightly slow because his wounds had not fully healed. Iris answered that he was not sleeping either. Winston sat down in the chair beside her and handed her one of the glasses. He said he was used to staying awake at night, and that this one had no alcohol in it, only juice. Iris took the glass, surprised that he remembered she did not drink, even though she had mentioned it only once in a passing conversation. She asked if he remembered that she did not drink. Winston answered that he remembered everything about her. Silence settled over them, broken only by the faint whisper of the night wind carrying the chill of a New York autumn and the distant noise of the city that never slept. Iris finally spoke. She said she couldn't sleep because she kept thinking about Molly. The surgery had been successful, but she was still afraid. Winston asked what she was afraid of. Iris looked down at the glass in her hands, her voice growing quieter, as though she were confessing something she had never told anyone before. She said she was afraid of losing her sister, that she had been afraid every day for 5 years since Molly was diagnosed with kidney failure, that every morning when she woke up, she feared that this would be the day her sister left her forever. Then she turned to look at Winston and asked whether he had ever been afraid of losing someone. Winston stared out toward the horizon, where the towers stood tall like silent watchmen in the night, and said that he used to think he did not know fear. He had lived in the underworld for too long and believed he had grown numb to everything. But then his father lay in that hospital bed, and he realized he was afraid, deeply afraid. Iris asked about Bradley. Winston was silent for a long while, his eyes fixed on the emptiness in front of him as though searching the dark for an answer. Then he said that he had been afraid of losing his brother, but that he had lost him long ago without realizing it, that he had lost Bradley back when he was still a boy, who felt abandoned in the shadow of an older brother. Iris did not know what to say to ease the pain in his voice, so by instinct she placed her hand over his, a simple gesture holding all the sympathy she knew how to give. Winston looked down at her small hand resting on his. He did not pull away the way she thought he might. He left it there and let himself feel the warmth of her touch. He said, "Bellamy," but Iris cut him off and said, "Iris, call me Iris." Winston looked at her, gray eyes meeting brown in the muted glow of the city lights, and said, "Iris," as though he were tasting the name on his lips and finding it sweeter than anything he had spoken before. Then he told her he wanted to thank her. Iris asked what for. Winston answered for everything, for saving his father, for being there with him during the days when he had been at his weakest, for being who she was, Iris Bellamy with honey brown eyes and a heart braver than anyone he had ever known. Iris felt her cheeks grow warm even though the night air was cold. She said he was not very good at thanking people, was he? Winston admitted that he was not used to it. Usually people thanked him, not the other way around. Iris said then he should practice. Winston looked at her, his eyes, so often cold as steel, now softened beneath the city lights, and said that he was practicing, with her. The intimate moment stretched on in silence, and neither of them wanted to break it. Then Iris did something that surprised even herself. She leaned her head against Winston's shoulder, letting her hair brush against him, letting her breathing melt into the night. Winston stiffened for a second, as though he did not know how to respond, but he did not push her away. Instead, he placed an arm around her shoulders and drew her a little closer, letting her rest against him more comfortably. They sat that way in silence, watching Manhattan slowly shift from night toward morning, until dawn rose along the horizon, and the first rays of sunlight turned the towers gold. Neither of them spoke about what was happening between them. It was not yet time to give it a name, but both of them knew that something had changed that night, changed forever, and could never be undone. 6 months after the night they sat on the balcony watching the dawn break, the Federal Court of New York opened Bradley Kovac's trial on a bitterly cold winter morning. Reporters swarmed outside the courthouse like vultures catching the scent of death. The case of the real estate tycoon poisoned by his own brother had dominated every front page for months, and today was the final day of judgment everyone had been waiting for. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled, every row crowded, the air so tense it felt almost impossible to breathe. Winston sat in the front row on the family's side, dressed in a black suit as though attending a funeral, his face expressionless beneath the mask of steel he had worn for so many years. Beside him sat Iris. In the past 6 months, she had become an irreplaceable part of his life. Not only the nurse who had cared for him, but also his companion, the shoulder he could lean on, the light in his darkest nights. Victor did not come. He refused to see the son who had betrayed him. He told Winston that he had lost Bradley on the day he learned the truth, and that he did not need to witness anything more. Bradley was led into the courtroom by the police. He was thinner than the last time Winston had seen him, his face pale from months spent in prison awaiting trial. But his green eyes did not lower. He still held his head high, as though he felt no regret for what he had done. As he passed Winston's row, Bradley paused for a brief second. The two brothers looked at each other across that short distance, no longer with the blazing hatred of the night in the penthouse, no longer with the bitterness that had filled their earlier confrontations, but only with the emptiness left behind by things lost forever. Then the police pushed Bradley onward toward the defendant's stand, and that fleeting moment between the brothers was gone. The trial lasted through the morning, with evidence presented one piece after another. The prosecutor introduced the toxicology results, showing thallium sulfate from the independent laboratory, the surveillance footage from Mount Sinai Hospital showing Bradley slipping into his father's room at 2 a.m, and testimony from witnesses, including Iris and the bodyguards who had been there on the day Bradley was exposed. Dr. Pemberton appeared as a witness. He had been stripped of his medical license and was facing separate charges for suppressing evidence and acting as an accomplice. He testified before the court in a trembling voice that he had been forced, that Bradley Kovac had known about his gambling debts and threatened to expose him if he did not cooperate in concealing Victor's true condition. Bradley's defense attorney tried to turn the case in another direction. He argued before the court that his client had lived his whole life in the shadow of his brother, emotionally abandoned, denied the recognition he deserved, and that this was a case of severe psychological disturbance. The prosecutor rose at once in objection, saying that the defendant had been fully capable of understanding his actions, that this had been a calculated scheme carried out over weeks, with poison prepared in advance, and every step planned in detail, not the impulsive act of someone who had lost control. The judge nodded and sustained the objection. Bradley sat in silence throughout the trial, listening as people spoke about his life, his motives, and his crimes, as though he were not even present. Near the end of the proceedings, the judge allowed the victim's family to speak, and Winston was called to the stand. He rose and walked to the witness stand with the steady bearing of a man who had faced countless hardships in his life. And there he stood, facing the court and facing his brother. Silence filled the room for a few seconds before Winston began to speak, his voice low and even as it always was. He said that he had given his brother everything he could: a position in the company, money, protection from every danger. He had thought that was love, but perhaps he had been wrong. He looked directly into Bradley's eyes and continued, saying that perhaps Bradley had needed something Winston did not know how to give: true recognition instead of favor handed down from above. He said he did not know anymore. He only knew that Bradley had chosen betrayal, and that he had to answer for that choice. Winston turned toward the judge and said that he was not asking for mercy for his brother, but neither did he want him to die. He wanted him to live and think about what he had done for the rest of his life. Then he stepped down and returned to his seat beside Iris. Bradley was given the right to make a final statement. He rose from the defendant's stand, looked slowly around the courtroom, and then stopped at Winston. His voice tightened when he asked whether Winston knew how deeply he had envied him. Silence. Bradley continued, saying that ever since he was a child, he had wanted to be like his brother, to be looked at by their father with the same pride Victor had always reserved for Winston, to be respected the way everyone respected him. But no matter how hard he had tried, he had never been enough. Tears began to slide down Bradley's cheeks, and Iris realized that this was the first time she had ever seen real tears on that man's face, not the false tears he had once practiced in front of a mirror. He said that he had been wrong, that he knew he had been wrong, but that he had not known any other way to be seen, any other way to make someone acknowledge that he existed. He lowered his head and said that he was sorry to his brother, sorry to his father. Winston said nothing, but Iris saw his hand gripping the arm of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The judge sentenced Bradley Kovac to 25 years in prison for deliberate poisoning and conspiracy to commit murder. As the police led Bradley out of the courtroom, he turned back for one last look at Winston and said that he hoped his brother found happiness, truly, and then he disappeared behind the heavy door as it slammed shut. Winston stood and walked out of the courthouse with Iris beside him. They did not speak to each other, but her presence at his side was everything he needed in that moment. When they reached the courthouse steps, where the weak winter sunlight fell across the stone, Iris took his hand. Her small, warm hand fit inside his larger, colder one. Winston said nothing, but he tightened his grip around hers as though it were the only lifeline keeping him from sinking into the black sea of grief below. 1 month after Bradley's sentencing, Iris stood at the door of the penthouse on the 58th floor with her small suitcase at her feet, the same suitcase she had brought here 6 months earlier, and the 2 boxes of books still exactly as they had been on the first day. 6 months had passed. Winston had fully recovered. The wounds in his shoulder and chest had healed completely, leaving behind only faint scars. He was able to return to running the Kovac Holdings empire as he had before, and she no longer had any reason to stay in this place for even 1 more day. She said that she was leaving, her voice carefully kept calm, as if this were only the parting between a nurse and a patient after the work was done. Winston stood a few steps away from her, his face unreadable behind the familiar steel mask he always wore in front of other people, and he asked where she would go. Iris answered that she would go back to Queens, back to her ordinary life, back to her tiny 240-square-foot apartment and the endless night shifts at Mount Sinai Hospital. Winston repeated the words ordinary life, as though they tasted strange on his tongue, as though he couldn't quite understand what such a thing meant. Iris nodded and said yes. The place where she did not have to worry about guns or plots or people trying to destroy one another. The place where she was only an ordinary nurse, caring for ordinary patients, and no one wanted anyone dead. Winston moved a little closer and said that she could stay. Iris lifted her eyes to his, her brown gaze meeting his gray one in a tense moment, and asked stay for what? She was no longer his nurse. He did not need her anymore. Winston said that he wanted her to stay. Silence filled the vast penthouse, broken only by the faint wind drifting in from the balcony and the sound of Iris's heart beating faster than usual. She said, "Winston, I don't belong in this world." He asked what world. She answered his world: power, money, schemes. She was only a poor nurse with medical debt and a cramped apartment. She did not know how to live inside luxurious penthouses or face enemies waiting in the shadows. Winston took another step forward, close enough that she could smell the expensive scent he wore, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, and he said that his world was missing people like her. Iris asked what he meant by people like her. Winston answered, "People who dare tell me to my face when I am wrong. People who are not afraid of me, even when they know who I am. People who—" He hesitated for a moment, then went on, "People who make me want to become a better man." Iris felt tears rising in the corners of her eyes. She said that was not a good enough reason for her to stay. Winston asked what reason would be good enough. She looked into those eyes that had once been cold as winter ice in the first days she knew him, and were now burning with something she did not dare name. And she whispered honestly that she did not know. She did not know how his world worked. She did not know whether she could live with his secrets. She did not know whether this thing between them was real, or whether it only existed because he had been lonely, and she had been the only person beside him during the days when he was weakest. Winston lifted a hand, hesitated for 1 second, then touched her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her like that, and his hand was so warm and gentle that Iris couldn't believe it was the hand of the Mafia boss who had once terrified the underworld. He asked whether she truly thought this was not real. Iris couldn't answer. Her throat had tightened too much. Winston drew his hand back and stepped away, giving her space to breathe, and said that he was not good at this, that emotions and relationships were not his strength, that he had spent his whole life in a world where emotion was weakness and trust could lead to death, but that he knew one thing. Iris asked what. Winston said that for the first time in his life he was afraid of losing something, and that thing was not his empire, not money or power, but something far more precious. Silence stretched between them, heavy and full of meaning. Iris picked up her suitcase and walked toward the elevator, but then she stopped and turned back to look at him. She said, "You know something, Winston?" He asked what. She said that the first time she met him, she had thought he was a monster, a cold and frightening monster. Winston asked, "And now?" She smiled, the first smile carrying something more than the professional kindness of a nurse toward a patient, and said that now she thought he was a monster trying to become human, and that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stepped into the elevator, her finger pressing the button for the ground floor. Winston spoke to her before the doors closed. He told her not to decide today, to go live her ordinary life, but to give him the chance to prove that she could trust him. The elevator doors slid shut, and Iris saw Winston's face one last time before the steel wall came between them, and she realized that those eyes were no longer cold. They were holding something she had never before seen in that man. Winston stood there alone, in the vast penthouse, staring at the place where she had just been standing, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful mafia boss in New York felt the room around him become so empty it was hard to breathe. That night, Iris sat by the window of her tiny 240-square-foot apartment in Queens, the place she had called home for the past 3 years, her brown eyes fixed on distant Manhattan, where the skyscrapers shimmered with light like a dream forever out of reach. Her phone vibrated, and a message from an unknown number appeared on the screen, but she knew instantly who it was without needing the name saved. The message said that the flower shop on the corner of 5th and 42nd opened at 7 in the morning, and that they carried the kind of flowers her mother had once loved. Iris went still. Her breath caught tight inside her chest. How did he know about her mother? She had never told him that detail. She had never spoken of the white flowers her mother used to grow in the little garden before the fire took everything away. A second message came right after that. He wrote that he would not contact her again unless she wanted him to, but he wanted her to know one thing. Then the third message appeared, and Iris felt as though her heart had been gripped in an unseen hand as she read the words. He wrote that for the first time in his life, he was afraid of losing something, and that thing was not his empire. Iris read those 3 messages over and over until tears blurred the screen of her phone, rolling down her cheeks while she made no move to wipe them away. She did not reply. Not yet. It was not time. She needed time to think, to understand what her own heart truly wanted. But she did not delete his number either. The next morning, at exactly 7, Iris stood at the corner of 5th and 42nd, in front of a small flower shop, so charming she could hardly believe she had never noticed it in all her years in the city. She looked through the clear glass and saw them there. Pure white flowers just like the ones her mother had once grown in that little garden long ago. Flowers of memory and love, flowers of happy days before tragedy struck. She did not go inside to buy them, not yet. But she stood there for a long time looking at those flowers and thinking about a man who had somehow found out something she had never told anyone, a man who had taken the time to understand her more deeply than anyone else ever had. Manhattan woke beneath the golden light of dawn, and the city that never slept began another day in its familiar rush. In Queens, a nurse sat by the window of her small apartment, phone in hand, her finger brushing over the contact of the most dangerous man in the city without daring to press call. In Midtown, a mafia boss stood by the glass wall of the penthouse on the 58th floor, looking toward Queens beyond the forest of towers, toward the place where he knew she was. Between them stretched an enormous city filled with millions of people. Between them stood 2 utterly different worlds, one of power and darkness, the other of simplicity and light. But between them as well, something else had begun to grow, something neither of them yet dared to name. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was only loneliness finding its mirror in this glittering but merciless city. But whatever it was real. It was sincere. And sometimes that is all we need to begin a new journey. Could 2 worlds ever truly meet? Could a poor nurse from Queens and the most powerful mafia boss in New York cross every barrier and somehow find their way to each other? The answer perhaps belongs to another story. But hope is always there. just as dawn always rises after the longest and darkest night. And that is the story we wanted to share with you today. A story about betrayal and loyalty, about power and love, about darkness and light. Dear friends, how did this story make you feel? After hearing it, what lesson do you take away for your own life? That sometimes a stranger may prove more trustworthy than family, that jealousy can destroy even blood ties, or that love can bloom in the last place we ever expect. We would truly love to hear the feelings in your heart, so please share your thoughts in the comments below so we can reflect together and connect with one another. If you found this story meaningful and moving, please press like, share this video with the people you love, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you will not miss the stories waiting for you each day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful and happy life, and days filled with peace and gladness. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.